And I see two ways, or two topics that we can think about more generally. And one is, how do we think in a structured way about the future of sustainability and sustainability research? And then secondly, to harken back to some of the discussions earlier today, how might we think about what we would like to see at BU for sustainability research and education? And so while the panelists are talking, please keep these in mind, and keep in mind that we'll have a reception at the end. Now, I usually think about this by quoting one of the great physicists of the 20th century. This is a really hard problem. We actually, in many ways, have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that we're going to do prediction in the sort of mathematically rigorous, deterministic sense. And we have to start talking about, number one, why does this research matter? And then ways in which we're going to structure our thinking about the future so that we can make some judgments. And there are many reasons why this matters. The global environmental changes that we're rightly concerned with have immediate local implications, which we've already seen today. But they as well have implications for decades to come. And this is one of the reasons why it is so important to think in a logical, structured manner about what the future might hold. And we really don't have the luxury to ignore what facts tell us or to ignore the experiences of others. As somebody who's worked on climate change and climate change issues for a very long time, or since the concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere were about 360 parts per million, this is particularly important because people have developed this really rather nasty habit of denying that this is a phenomenon that actually occurs. Or if it does occur, it's going to turn out all right and it's not going to be so bad and we'll buy our way out of the problem. This is not an issue of belief. It's an issue of considered evidence. And I think that's one of the ways in which the university setting and a research setting has something really important to offer because we are, after all, trained in understanding the consequences of evidence. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we are, in fact, collectively managing risks, that nothing is completely determined, even as we seek to understand the world better. And so I want to take a little bit of a diversion into why risk matters and how you adapt. And so you can think about adapting to change as sort of reacting to impacts that have already happened. The recoveries from Sandy, from Katrina, this notion of hardening coastal defenses or improving wildfire detection and response. But this is not the whole story. And the reason that thinking about the future is so important is that we also have to anticipate change, that the baseline is not constant. We have shifting baselines. There are many ways in which the future will not be like the past. And so the concept of risk, how much risk are we willing to tolerate and how do we manage that risk, becomes particularly important. So now this is the place where I do arithmetic. And so this is the example of why understanding risk is so important. So let's just imagine for a minute that you have, every year, you have sort of a 1 in 100 chance of some unacceptable outcome. The once in a century flood, the once in a century fire, the once in a century heat wave. Lots of ways to think about outcomes that would be very, very costly or unacceptable to you in some ways. And if you think about it in a longer term context, all of a sudden 1 in 100 isn't really the relevant statistic. So think about this in the context of something that all homeowners know about, which is the 30-year fixed mortgage. In 30 years, the chance of that outcome actually occurring is about 1 out of 4. Right? So the only way it doesn't occur in 30 years is if it doesn't occur every single year for 30 years in a row. And you'll do this calculation in statistics if you haven't done it already. So the chance that it occurs at least once in 30 years is 27%. If you think about it in a slightly longer time frame, say you refinanced after a decade, then you're thinking about 50 years. And over 50 years, there's a 40% chance that you'll get that 1 in 100 outcome, even if the baseline hasn't changed. And it might be worthwhile thinking about that in the context of the fixed infrastructure. Warren Towers is 50 years old this year. Just saying. So how do we actually know anything about the future? Right? So there are lots of different ways in which we can write models and or or construct chains of logic that lead us down the future. But there's really sort of three paths that people typically follow, and one is this sort of idea of gradualism, that over a short period of time, the future is not too different from now. We understand a lot about trends in technological progress or economic changes, and over short periods of time, it's not too bad an assumption to think that things won't be substantially different than they are today. A second way, and one that's really popular, especially in popular literature, is to think about black swans. That is, what's the killer app? What's the technological innovation that's really just simply going to transform our life? Whether it's with respect to sustainable agriculture and food security, climate change, communications, energy production, or energy use. And then a third way to think about the future, which is gaining some acceptance, is to think about really using all of the breadth of our knowledge, this sort of integration of a whole suite of intellectual disciplines, and create a joint way of understanding the processes that actually begin to shape the world, and then using that knowledge to generate different scenarios of change. And here we might distinguish between, in a sense, unbounded scenarios. How do we think the world is going to unfold and evolve? Or to take Ann Short's point that we are, in fact, in sustainability research, driven by our own values, that we think about scenarios that first imagine a desirable endpoint and then ask the question, what's the pathway? How do we get there from here? Both of these, I think, are completely valid, but they are different ways, different structured ways of thinking about the future. In any of these cases, we are, in fact, moving into uncharted territory. But it matters, right? We need to acknowledge that the world's not going to wait while we sort out the things that we're not so sure about. That we need to understand that we're managing risks, and our research and our knowledge base is contributing to managing risks as well as seeking to understand the world better. And that this, in fact, is the epitome of being useful while at the same time being interesting. So with that, let me move to the panel. I'm not going to introduce everybody individually because you have their bios available to you on the web. And I will waste no more time, but ask Professor Kaufman to start.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks everybody for being here. I know most of the people in the room spend a lot of time thinking about the topics we're discussing today, but I don't know about you, I spend a lot of that time alone in a room or on a boat, and it's incredibly gratifying to see that there are other people suffering through the same dilemmas. It's a little odd to be asked to talk about the future of sustainability because if we don't figure this problem out, there won't be any future. But what I'd like to do today is just talk briefly about 3 points. The growth of sustainability as a discipline at BU and abroad, most of the time on crafting a science of sustainability, and finally, what can we say about sustainability in the face of rapid global change? So, we know that we have a wonderful program, Sustainability at BU. We have had a successful, I think, movement among faculty and students to have an open discussion of BU's posture on fossil fuels and, in fact, all topics related to sustainability. And in a moment, I'll talk more about research. I just want to put in a pitch for the need. I know there are some development people here. There's a dire need to figure out new ways of raising money for integrative and interdisciplinary research because National Science Foundation and other funding agencies are just coming around to it. And finally, that really what we're talking about is the birth of a new clinical profession. The analogy between environmental science and medicine is overdone, I think, but in this particular instance, we're really talking about setting an example for and training several new generations of clinical researchers who, instead of just healing individuals, heal the world. And a place to start here at BU is with pedagogy. There are many, many enterprises underway that are learning how to teach about sustainability, but some of them are embattled. Even in our School of Education, we have a wonderful program led by Doug Zook, with several components to teach teachers how to incorporate environmental and systems thinking into their classrooms, but I'm not sure that the importance of this enterprise is fully acknowledged. We need to strengthen our pedagogy. We need to expand the liberal arts curriculum, not to compete with essential topics and disciplinary skills, but to pull the university together around this existential crisis that we're facing. And I've also noticed that at a graduate level, we need to improve interdisciplinary training on all sides, that our grad students are being produced as good professionals, but not totally prepared to tackle the problems we're discussing today. Now, the research itself, the research I do, is aimed at trying to help craft a science of sustainability. And like any science, it has components of observation and comparative study. It requires experimental interventions to test the hypotheses that we come up with. And ultimately, all of those experiences and data are amassed in theory and models. And to me, the core question is whether the dynamics of human-inhabited ecosystems actually are lawful. Can we construct realistic scenarios, choose among them, and try and guide our society in those directions? And the instrument that I use to study this is a modeling platform, but it could be any. Now, I am part of a program at the Pardee Center called CHANS, I can't even remember what it means. Coupled, thank you. My brain has become uncoupled. Coupled human and natural systems. This is a difficult acronym that was invented without the A by the National Science Foundation. But there actually is a network of people in the US and abroad specifically studying this. And we have chosen to study it through detailed comparative analysis of multiple large systems. And the ones illustrated here are, from left to right, the lower Mekong Basin and the Great Lake, Tonle Sap, eastern Massachusetts, basically the marathon route out to Stellwagen Bank, Gulf of Honduras with a focus on the Mesoamerican Reef in Belize, East Africa with a focus on Lake Victoria, Lake Tana, and the rest of the headwaters of the Nile system. And then in the corner over there is Brazil, which I keep trying to squeeze in. We actually have funded projects in all of these now, and it's a demanding activity, but I just want to talk for a minute about Massachusetts. The map on the left is our study area, which is the Charles River Basin, with a close focus on Broadmoor Wildlife Sanctuary on the Natick-Sherborne line and Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary to the east. The modeling framework we use is called MIMES, and it was developed by Robert Costanza and Roel Beaumont. Roel Beaumont is my head modeler, and no one ever knows quite where Bob is these days. I think Australia. And these are some of my collaborators. And the important thing about the model is that it tries to integrate everything we know about the living biosphere, society, and the anthroposphere, and the other domains that contribute to the function of these systems: water, atmosphere, earth. Now, in the Charles system at Broadmoor, we're looking at the dynamics of wildlife-human interactions and landscape planning. The upper left, the Landsat photo with reserve. The lower left, one of our chief drivers, beavers. And beavers have a scenario that they've chosen, and it is to be fruitful and multiply and drown most of the sanctuary. And in the lower right are two organisms that are affected by this: the tree swallow, which eats aerial insects that come from the ponds created by the beavers and from open fields, and river herring that would connect the sanctuary Broadmoor with Stellwagen if the dam system and fish bypass system on the Charles were completed. And so what we're trying to do at Broadmoor is structure the model so that it helps the Audubon Society manage the sanctuary to maintain biodiversity and provide a continuous flow of ecosystem services. Going down the river to the sanctuary are the herring that you see in the upper middle, and several other forage species that are fed upon by the 6 top predators that we are studying. And what we've been doing over the last 4 years is studying the nutritional value of alternative prey. You see on the left comparison of fatty acid content and the structure of the food web, which we construct by weighing all the atoms, by looking at stable isotope ratios and trying to figure out who eats who. Now, these data go into a heuristic model that you see here of how material and biomass flow in the system. And we see that these little red dots are places where biomass aggregates and people come to get it or to see it. And there are pathways here for animal migration and commerce. So everything here is focused on offshore banks. We put 120 spatial data layers together and inferred the driving processes through several hundred equations that are familiar, any one of them, and ran this model MIMES. And what it gives us is a spatiotemporally explicit output of ecosystem service flows and trade-offs. And here what you see on the left is where whale watch value would be lost in the average month of July if you allowed fishermen to take an aliquot of the small fish that the whales like to eat. And the interesting thing is it forced us to think about how whales feed. And for whale watching, it's not the number of herring or sand lance out there that matter, it's how concentrated they are. And if you drag a net through them, they become dispersed, and the whales simply go elsewhere. The fishery thinks it's okay to catch half the fish. Half the fish is way beyond the threshold where the whales will have left. So what we're trying to do is focus on these crux points in the system so that decision makers know how to concentrate their efforts. Now, I'd just like to remind everybody that among the great crises we're facing, overpopulation, climate change, inequity, the other big one is mass extinction. And there has been a tendency for the world's NGOs to adopt the strategy that if you just tell people that they need nature and show them how, they will be willing to set large areas aside as reserves, and they will be careful as they step through the system. The problem is that despite many years of multiple strategies to reverse mass extinction, anthropogenic mass extinction, we are losing the war. So we've begun to formally examine the relationship between human well-being and biodiversity. What is biodiversity really doing for us in the short term and the long term? This graph shows on the x-axis, it's a little confusing because you're going from high biodiversity, the starting condition on the left, to low on the right, and human well-being on the y-axis. And what it shows is our first hypothesis, basically that as human well-being increases because it's eating nature, biodiversity slowly goes down, and then it reaches an inflection point where the loss of any further biodiversity will compromise ecosystem services and damage society. The problem is that inflection point is well into a mass extinction. We do not think far enough ahead to consider the consequences of losing a third or half of living species. Now, we're living in a time of rapid change, so the question is it worth the effort? Is it going to pay off to facilitate adaptation and persistence of natural communities that we value through successive events like mass bleaching events, such as the one we're witnessing now? So a major focus of my lab is on the molecular biology and ecology of coral's ability to withstand successive climate anomalies. And on the left is a picture of a revegetated, I'm not sure quite how to say it, recorrelated stretch of reef that was utterly destroyed in 1998 by the second great mass bleaching event, and now has been restored through the farming and replanting of coral. Now, the success of an endeavor like this, those are my students on the right, learning how to do it. The question is, should I be teaching them? If the interbleaching interval is less than 15 years, there's nothing we can do. You have to have a certain dwell time between investing in major restoration efforts, or you'll lose out. So I think finding out what is worth doing and what isn't worth doing should be one of our great objectives. Finally, there are several technical frontiers in doing this kind of modeling that make it a lot of fun, but are also formidable. One is it presumptuous to try to create behavioral agents that simulate people's thinking so that you can get a more realistic outcome in the model? How do you extract accurate landscape dynamics from remote sensing data streams? What kind of empirical science should we prioritize to learn about the key processes driving the system? How do we fully incorporate nonlinear dynamics into these models? That's something we've been working on for several years. And finally, how do we take these results and create decision tools that are friendly and usable by decision makers on the ground? Thanks.
Good afternoon. One of the issues I face here is that I've made the mistake of listening to these wonderful sets of panels and realizing the potential confusion or the coming together of ideas that will produce something that is a synergy we hadn't anticipated. So I want to talk a little bit about a perspective. I'm a historian, works on environmental issues, but what I find among the group of people that are coming together here and specific colleagues in biology, ecology, earth and environment systems, history, my own discipline, and from graduate students in those fields that focused in the right direction bring people together with new questions, new ideas, and new methods. So one of my goals here was to talk about the CHANS project, of which I'm a member, but less, even though he very modestly said he wasn't talking about that, he just did.
Uh-oh.
This notion of coupled human and natural systems is a very provocative but also energizing sets of ideas that we in having conversations together, having research that overlaps, we can begin to think about systems and also their change over time. As a historian, I want to say that yes, the future matters. Fred Pardee gave us the mission of talking about the long-range future. To that, I'd like to add the historical notion of the longue durée, the longer-lasting historical processes that we can look at in the past, ask questions of, and it's a bit different than thinking about predictions for the future, as Tony mentioned. That's a difficult exercise. But by connecting the past to the present to the future, we can begin to get a pretty good sense of what are possibilities. What are the changes we can make subtly or more dramatically, but how that connects to the complicating measures of politics, of economic change, of environmental change, and of fundamental issues of change we haven't yet anticipated. So rather than saying so much about CHANS now, I want to just raise a couple of issues here. Let me begin here. What we are doing, and I would like to continue to do, is to take those notions of CHANS, coupled human and natural systems, and apply them to other geographies. One of them, of course, is the Mekong Delta, which is going to be affected not by just local issues, but also by issues of how China is able to sign an agreement, make an agreement with President Obama about how to reduce carbon emissions, simply by doing hydroelectric that affects all of their neighbors and transfers their neighbors' environment. What we thought of the Tonle Sap lake in Cambodia is going to cease to exist because the Chinese management of annual water flows, seasonal water flows, will transform the ecology of that downstream ecology environment. These are taking place in Belize, they're taking place in Massachusetts, where I did see large numbers of herring swimming up the Mystic River.
Yeah, they're doing it now. You should go see them.
Are they now? I was there
right this minute.
I was there yesterday. They weren't there yet.
What? After the reception. Sorry.
But these systems are comparable, and the method for comparing these systems is a fundamental task of the CHANS program. It's what we have in mind. My particular area is the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile is, despite what Les Kaufman will tell you, the majority of the water flowing to Egypt. Without Lake Tana and the Blue Nile system, we'd have a whole lot less water. So we look at the ecology of elevation, of the flow of the water seasonally, of the effect of building a bridge, as as you see here, transforms the local response of human livelihoods, human activities. What is that transformative effect of changing the movement of the water, of adapting to the movement of the water in agriculture, in fisheries, in where protein comes from, in where people obtain livelihoods? So what I thought I would do is shift a little bit from talking about Chan's and talk about one other thing that Tony mentioned, but I'll take an opposite point of view, which is one of the great features of the Pardee Center, is that I would say that, in fact, issues of belief matter very much. And so what I want to do is to share with you, within the local environment of the Blue Nile watershed, two perspectives on the nature of nature and how people believe and respond to changes in politics, changes in their physical environment, changes in the way they make a living, from agriculture to fisheries to service sectors, to the way we understand a larger system and where it's going. So, from the Blue Nile Basin, here are two images that I collected very recently, but reflect the past, visions of the future, and also what we might think about in terms of the effect of belief in local populations that represent a not dysfunctional, but a way of perceiving the natural world that we must think about when we talk about policy development. The first one is taken very recently on the lower right-hand corner. It is a billboard in the city of Bahir Dar, very near the source of the Blue Nile. And here you have the head of state, the late head of state, depicted by his national set of portraiture artists who show him with a vision. It almost looks like a John Ford Western, except he's looking to the wrong side. He's looking at the Blue Nile Dam. The Blue Nile Dam, or the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, as it's known now, will be the largest dam in Africa, one of the largest in the world, and an ambitious plan funded totally by Ethiopian monies, both locally and money extracted from the diaspora, to transform the Nile system historically as it's existed in its relationship to the Nile system as a whole. They are going to provide, according to the plan, hydropower for the Nile Valley. It includes Sudan, Kenya, Egypt, and of course, Ethiopia. This is a vision. You can see in the hierarchical lettering there, it says this is the vision, the ayah of Ethiopia, and this is modernization. This is the high modern project. So we could represent this as a regional vision of what is anticipated for Ethiopia when it begins to harness the water available in the system, despite the fact that the IPCC projection says that there may be a 75% reduction in the total amount of water available. The engineers didn't really think about that, but the planning has to do with the high modernist image. On the left side is an image from a church. This is not completely, but a predominantly Orthodox Christian area. And in the church, one of the local churches, you find a painting by the artist's conception of the world. And what the label of this church painting says, it's in the corner of the church, along with other iconic images from the Bible, is the way of, it says man or mankind, the way of humankind. And here it presents the idyllic version of someone harvesting nature's bounty. He's in the tree, he's full-faced, you can tell he's a good guy, he's a Christian. He's harvesting, putting into his basket, unaware of the real nature of nature, may well be a pessimistic one. In this case, he's going to be shot by a soldier who's wearing the uniform of one of the imperial army. It says he's the angel of death. If the soldier doesn't shoot this optimist up in the tree, the serpent, the snake down below, is going to get him. If not, the rats eating away at the root structure of the tree are going to get him. Not an optimistic view, but a view that people incorporate into their basic system of beliefs represented by the church. That's a fundamental, deep-seated understanding about changes in policy, the way they might view this longer-term vision of the world that you see in the lower right-hand corner. So I think the nature of belief here matters a lot. As we look at local understanding of what nature is, we can reconstruct that. We can say, under what terms do people make a scientific revolutionary change in the way they think about the natural world? It's possible. When has it happened? When might it happen? Is, I think, worth investigation. And I think this is a way of broadening, from a historical perspective, how we look at the next stage of the future. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the last I'm going to speak last in the last panel, so I'm hoping that all of you are still sort of here for the discussion that ensues, because I'm really looking forward to some feedback on what I'm going to speak about, more specifically perhaps to set a research agenda which comes at the intersection of city planning and sustainability. So thank you, Tony. Thank you, Lucy, and thanks to Dean Cudd and all the organizers for inviting me here. And for those of you who don't know, my little label says that I'm from the Metropolitan College, but really there are 90 programs in there. So within the Metropolitan College, I teach at the City Planning and Urban Affairs program, and that's where my background is, just to give you a sense. So throughout the day, we have learned about the incredible research on issues all across BU and beyond, and all related to sustainability, many of them, most of them multidisciplinary, and certainly timely for what's happening around us and around the world. And more or less all these solutions or all this research in some way is going to impact the way we live our lives in this century and perhaps even beyond that. So we've learned about depleting snow covers as to how that affects sustainable outcomes. We've learned about sort of the inertia of energy transitions. And I still remember the first thing that I heard, I believe Nathan said it, that we have to go from looking at smart cities to understanding how we can transition from smart cities to really wise cities. So within all this, research as a city planner and as my training as an architect, I really wanted to, where my primary work centers on climate adaptation, I really wanted to look at or perhaps get feedback on the kind of research that needs to be done between the intersection of city planning and sustainability. So both as a researcher and a citizen of the city of Boston, I'm eager to understand how these sustainable solutions will ultimately impact the urban fabric of our cities, and how as individuals are we going to be affected in terms of the quality of our life. So within this context, I wanted to sort of, talk about, share a small story, a story about a neighborhood and change. And this is a story, for those of you who are Boston natives, is a story of a great little neighborhood which everybody is sort of touting as the exemplar of sort of new urban planning, and that's Jamaica Plain. So about 10 to 11 years ago, actually a little more than 11, we moved to JP, and we were in this really dense sort of urban plot, if you will. Oh, and I think you can see a little sort of map right over here at this corner. So this is where we moved, and that's sort of a little dead-end street, but very close to the street, we have a tea station, the Stony Brook tea station. So when we moved there, we were on the wrong side of the tracks. And so instead of Jamaica Plain, the place was called Jamaica Spain. And it was all very nice because there was the Southwest Corridor Park sort of close by, tea stops, and so on and so forth. And fast forward sort of 10 or 11 years, and now Jamaica Plain has become this incredible hub of economic development, of transport-oriented development, and really in so many ways, sort of the way the community is coming together, the planning is coming together, the attention of the Boston Redevelopment Authority and so on, Jamaica Plain is booming. no matter who you ask, they're going to tell you that this is certainly a place where there has been a lot of success. However, in terms of sort of the indicators of success, some of them are that a lot of the property values have risen over 100%. There are a lot of brand new, shiny, multi-story condos which have sort of taken over the dilapidated single-family homes. And then, of course, there's transport-oriented dense development going on in the neighborhood. Every sort of urban planner's dream, there's plenty of reduction of parking spaces because, God forbid, we have more cars in the city than people, right? And last but not the least, in terms of city planning and development, there's been tremendous variances given by the city to increase the existing densities because we are looking for economies of scale and so on in terms of how we develop neighborhoods, communities, cities, countries. And the developers also get a lot of financial incentives, if you will, for what they call density bonuses. The truth of the matter is, well, before I go into that, all this really means that Jamaica Plain is sort of a great example of what we call smart growth. And smart growth is considered sort of the gold standard of planning for sustainability, if you will. But if we step back and start to look at what it means for the individual, for the citizen, for the people who actually are going through these communities where such tremendous changes are taking place, I have only one thing to say to you. This morning, as I did when I woke up, I had this overwhelming sense of sadness because where I was standing, in my home, the sky around me had been shut out. So I will go back to my first image, which was this, and it is not an image of what I'm seeing every day, but certainly very much so all around this area where we live. And it's not just only me, but so many other people that live in that neighborhood. The sky is being shut out. So this then brings me to, what does this mean? What does this mean? What can we do about it? We are all sort of on this bandwagon of developing for sustainability, but what does this really mean? What is the physical manifestation of that? How does that change the urban fabric of our cities? Well, what's happening is that the overall quality of life has gotten significantly impacted. My broadband speed is so slow, as it is for most of my neighbors, that I can almost never work in the evening. So now I wake up at 4 in the morning just so that I can get a good broadband speed. There's absolutely no parking anymore in front of my home because there are so many cars and so much reduction of parking spaces because now we live a 5-minute walk from the T. Well, then people ask, why do you have a car anymore? This is the United States. You need a car more often than not. So just to live, just to be able to get to the hospital, get your groceries once in a while. So I just want to say that this story is not a personal story. This is a story we hear again and again and again when we start to go out into the communities and the neighborhoods to understand how we should plan when we have these massive planning charrettes. And there always seems to be a them and an us. Us meaning the planners who know what the gold standard is for planning, such as smart growth, and them, which is also me, the inhabitants of the neighborhoods who are fighting this and they don't quite know why. Because on the face of it, it seems like we are going towards a sustainable future. So, as Tony framed this at the beginning, when we started to sort of put this conference together, he said, it is important to evaluate our options and choices. Sorry, Tony, we're kind of talking like you're not in the room, but evaluate our options and choices beyond the technocratic and rational models. So along the research, alongside the research on the right model, I would argue that it is equally important that we look at the right fit to sustain the human element of all this growth towards sustainable futures. And we need to understand that, particularly in terms of our manifestation of sustainable growth in the built environment, there are many more far-reaching implications that you could ever begin to imagine. Oops, wrong slide.
Definitely.
Oh, definitely wrong. Okay, never mind. I guess what I was trying to get at is I was looking at sort of different scales. And when I started to look at sort of the neighborhood scale and understand, I also wanted to look at what was going on in the national arena. And believe it or not, there are quite a few Republicans now, even those who are in the Trump camp, who do believe that global warming is happening. And also, at the same time, while there is this growing awareness, there is plenty of activity and research and agencies and conferences and so on sustainability research. In fact, research on sustainability has grown almost twice as fast as overall research between 2009 and 2013. And there's a total of 72% of the S&P companies who published a sustainability report since 2013. However, and this is my second last slide, while all this work on sustainability is going on, there is almost an indisputable sort of scenario here where we can see that by 2050, and that's the second map here below, by 2050 there's going to be a huge percentage change in the land use, which is going to become quite urban. And then if you look at these maps here, this is in the year 2000, I believe, and this is 2050, where we are going to see a tremendous amount of forest cover being lost. Well, the connection I'm trying to make here is that our cities, our country, our urban areas are changing very, very drastically. And while we are all sort of on this bandwagon of trying to find sustainable solutions, we are somehow not, perhaps we need to also start to consider what it means once we implement them. So I'm going to kind of go back really quickly and go back to my first story and sort of try to create, pull it all together. So it's obvious from all the literature and research that is out there that planning for sustainability in a way that privileges technical and financial solutions to sustainability by and large ignores the idea of quality of life. So if you're going to have transit-oriented development, that's all it is about. Nobody goes back to do any post-facto analysis to find out what happens to these communities which now are sustainable in terms of all the indicators that we have given, right? So this is where, and I'm going to close with this is where sort of the new research agenda comes in, and it's not quite flushed out. But it's important to note that while we have planned for cities, especially when we have been under pressure or then there has been a whole wave of sort of going towards a particular thing. So, for example, the urban renewal movement, which was at its heights in the 1960s, where there was so much of white flight, slum clearance, and so on, those had long-standing ramifications on how we live today. When entire cities in the United States were reconfigured because the car was going to be the next technological advancement of the century, we reconfigured the entire ways we lived just so that we could accommodate the car. So the point here is that while we are all rushing, and me included, rushing to create all these solutions to find what is feasible, what is not, what is the best financial model, what is the best scientific model, what are the pros and cons, accurate predictions, projections, and so on, we also need to understand that while we do this, at the same time, there perhaps needs to be a parallel research agenda where we understand that once we do implement this, what are the ramifications? Because that is what is going to set the stage for the next century to come. So as city planners and urbanists who work at the intersection of climate change and sustainability, like we do at the City Planning and Urban Affairs program at BU, I think it is important for us, not as much as it is to understand what solutions are there to create sort of sustainable futures, we also need to understand that these sustainable futures need to not only accommodate, but really be centered around the human element. Thank you.
Madhu, Jim, Les, thank you very much. So I'm going to try to prime the pump a little bit with one or two questions, and then as we've done before, I want to open this up to questions from all of you to get some discussion going. We'll run this for about a half hour, and then we're going to give Lucy the last word. We aren't going to give you a lot of time to make the last word.
But the pressure is on anyway.
Reduce the risk. So the first thing that I want to get the panelists to respond to this a little bit. In many ways, what each of you has described is, in a sense, sort of a different way of thinking about how do we identify and respond to a whole series of tipping points, places where a decision really has to be made before a system's trajectory goes off in some undesirable direction. So Les talked about that in the sense of actual numerical models and models that actually incorporate coupled human and natural processes. Jim talked about it in the sense of understanding the arc of history and the influence of development goals and values on prospects for the future, and Madhu talked about it in the sense of how do we introduce a human element in design, and particularly in the design of new urban spaces. And so I guess the question I'd like each of you to think about and talk about a little bit is this business of tipping points or really important critical trends. And the question is really, how good are we at identifying these before we reach them? We're really good at identifying them in the rearview mirror, right? Uh-oh, that was a mistake. But how good are we at identifying them beforehand? Because it seems to me that this is actually a critical feature of trying to be more sustainable.
Which way are we going?
Is the question for me? Well,
For all of you.
Oh, it's for all of us in either direction.
you're just looking at me. I actually think that identification is not really a problem. I think we know what the problems are in the system or what needs to be done long before we actually need to start to address them in a systematic way. So I guess we really need to understand that I think the question here is, why is there inertia and why do we make mistakes, at least to my mind? And in a sense, I would say that throughout the history, we have not really learned from our mistakes. So, for example, when we just spent over $1 billion with the Big Dig project to sort of get back to, to rectify our mistake of putting the highway through the city of Boston. So, I'm not quite there yet, but
Or not putting
yes.
the highway. The central area, which is not served by public transportation or by a superhighway,
Exactly.
is a food desert.
Yeah.
You almost live there.
Yes,
We
that's
all
true.
know.
That's true.
There are rats under it. You can eat those.
Can I say, this in reference to Les's contribution here, I think monitoring the system, understanding the system in the fashion of knowing that whale watching is what happens on the surface of the water. Below the surface, different in the column of water, you have a whole set of changes going on. Those are the changes we need to understand. So that is a way of both using the past, present, to allow us to make some reasonable decisions about the future. Whose livelihood is affected by that?
That's true, Jim. And we can run the model back or forwards. And of course, the point of the model isn't to say what's going to happen. We have no idea. The point of the model is to construct likely alternative scenarios so you make critical decisions. But one thing that I've been frustrated in trying to infuse into the process when we make models to facilitate decision making are two things I think are lacking. One, which we might be able to address here at BU in our teaching, is most people are not aware of their own wiring, of how they think, and how the way people think limits us. That we are, for the most part, front-end loaded. We're interested in what affects us immediately. Anything beyond that fades quickly into the distance. So we need to teach about and practice thinking ahead, and not just leave it to our leaders. God forbid one in particular. But the other thing that I think is really missing from the process that I described, which is very clinical and cold, is the need to resurrect the concept of sanctity, that some things are just sacred. We have it in law. The species I care so much about, it says you may not drive a species to extinction. It says it in the laws of many countries, and it's part of international law, and look what we're doing anyway. And it's because people don't respect that. And the reason for having those laws, having those principles, is that they're about things we can't predict the outcome of. They're precautionary measures. Precautionary is the least popular word in U.S. environmental law. And I don't know how, but we need to reinstitute it. So understanding our human nature and adapting to who and what we are is, in the long run, more important than me perfecting the MIMES model.
So just say that so therefore you've to some degree subscribed to the notion of we have to deal with a set of beliefs about the natural world that, Madhu, the chart you showed about the changing beliefs about the nature of climate change is significant.
Yeah, but
what is the tipping point there in terms of belief turning into action for us as a nation, for the global community, in terms of what we do with respect to negotiations over what's happening with Southeast Asia and the waters that are coming out of China and flowing into the Cambodian.
Yeah, but Jim, let me ask you guys something. I have a problem. I don't believe in belief, really. I mean,
that's a belief.
That's a belief, right? No, I mean, I am trained. Most of us here are trained the way a judge would be trained to step outside ourselves and attempt to be as objective as possible and to make decisions on the basis of evidence. But most people don't work that way. And another thing that would be worth examining, maybe having another whole symposium on, God forbid, is how we should reconcile this divide between the technocracy, which is trying to view the world objectively, and the vast bulk of the human population who don't have time to do anything but, listen to other people and decide what to do. And they're mostly influenced by their friends. That part of the tissue, the fabric of society, is still a little off kilter.
So as much as I value the ability to ask the panel a question and then watch them duke it out amongst themselves, I'm going to tempt fate by asking you another question.
That's not one trial learning.
Actually, Tony, I had more answers to your first question, but we'll wait.
You just keep them in mind. So it does seem to me that a lot of what you've all talked about this afternoon, and actually what a number of our panels talked about during the day, is an inability to actually understand the consequences of a whole set of decisions that we make, whether they're economically driven or values driven. And so we're faced with this challenge that much of sustainability is really about actions that have consequences at a distance. at a geographic distance, at a
Temporal.
distance in
Temporal,
time,
yeah.
an intergenerational distance. And it in some sense, to me, this is sort of analogous to, I don't know if you've all been reading about sort of the Internet of Things,
Yes.
right? So this idea that your thermostat is tied to your phone, is tied to your car, is tied to, it's a little scary, right? Because the idea that somebody can drive by and hack your thermostat could really play havoc with everything that Cutler talked about earlier today. But instead, what we have is this idea, and we haven't talked that much about it today, is that the sustainability of stuff, right? Where does our food come from? How many people actually understand the decisions that we make in terms of diet and consumption affects soil quality and the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, because that has implications for the agricultural breadbaskets of the country, or for international food trade. That the decisions that we make about energy infrastructure or transportation infrastructure has implications for where stuff comes from. Where's the gravel coming from? What kind of a scar does that leave on the landscape? How long does that last? And so this notion that sustainability is in fact a part of sustainability research is understanding how these kinds of decisions ramify through the environment seems to me at least to be important. Does that resonate? Does the question of then who benefits and who decides is that important in your vision of what constitutes the sustainability of the future?
Well, can I say that connecting to my two colleagues here, they both have raised the question of education, the next generation, and how do we build these sensibilities into where does this food come from? As you walk down the supermarket aisle, thinking about the constituent elements of what you're consuming, what you're buying, and you can see that take place in a classroom where students begin to say, oh, okay, and they make their own connections. And so the education, I think, is one part that we can have some degree of control, or if not control, at least managing the information that our students are confronted with. I think that ends up being a very important issue about how we think about what is our contribution to the next, what's coming.
Other perspectives?
Yeah. You want to go or?
No, I'm still thinking.
Okay, you keep thinking. I actually would, I have a different way of looking at this whole thing. I think, Tony, what you're alluding to, in part, is that our lives are increasingly sensitive to connectivity among things, among processes, among the different parts of our lives. And what that leads quickly to is an appreciation of the fact that we are complex systems, we live in a complex system, together we comprise a complex system. And complexity is something that at least Western society has traditionally been deeply uncomfortable with. Because in complexity, you acknowledge that an enormous amount of the future is not predictable. It's what Tony was getting at earlier. It generates a kind of humility that is often lacking in our discussions. And I think that, to me, it's humbling that some guy could hack my thermostat, because it's the same as lightning striking my house, except people are really much more likely to do absurd things like that. And I would advocate that we launch a campaign to bring more people aboard, through education principally, this deeper understanding of and humility for the complex system that we are a part of. And if that worked, then maybe they would understand science better. And maybe they would also understand that scientists, with or without God, have a deeply spiritual relationship with the natural world out of awe, respect, and shock at the way this system works. That's something I think we can share with non-technical people, and we should.
Could I add a
Oh, whoa. I'm running for president.
Tony,
This is running for president on the humility ticket.
Tony, if I could say an
That
example-
sounds wrong.
An example of this, concrete example, which I actually had part of my presentation and I just left it off, was think of Zika, Zika virus. We thought of that as one component. It's a virus some people could get. Well, you begin to expand out to what its meanings are. Add to that climate change. Suddenly Zika can affect Philadelphia, certainly the southern tier of the U.S., to Belize, all these places that are, and the disease, we don't fully understand the implications. So that complexity, if it becomes a norm to think about, all right, there's a new disease, what's the vector, what are the symptoms, how does it affect our investment in healthcare? What if we lose the Olympics, which seems increasingly likely? That's a major effect on people's sensibilities about what's important in their lives. So I think it's an example of where if we begin to see people expect complexity, that's a bit of a victory.
A bit. It would be stupendous.
I was just going to say that in terms of complexity, I don't think anybody's denying that there is, these issues are not complex or that we don't live in a complex environment. I think, and I think the real issue here as researchers or educators and so on, well, one of the issues which I think is important is I think what are the things that we are going to pull out within this complex system that we are going to actually use to educate future generations, or we are going to use to sort of further our research and our work. And I think that is a more difficult question to answer. It's not so much sort of I think we all acknowledge that we live in complex systems, but I think, how to navigate these complex systems is really sort of where our roadblocks lie, at least within our field, if you will.
Yeah, but Madhu, I think there are two things that are very important that we're forgetting about, we're not stewarding properly. One is the enormous cultural diversity that we have. It's a huge treasure. And the other is the diversity of creation, of living things. And we're witnessing the mass extinction of both. And my question is, what is the most rapid surgical intervention that would turn that around? Because those are the resources on which we base our education and we build our value systems.
So this goes back to, I think, Tony's original question and sort of perhaps answers a little bit of yours, is I suspect, and I think historically so, these kinds of acknowledgements and being able to steer sort of complexities towards doing, say, sustainable futures, for example, really only happens when there are crises in sort of systems, right? The minute you're at a crisis point, you immediately start to acknowledge and understand and steer accordingly. And I think that inertia is always going to be there till there is a crisis, and that's really when.
Then we should celebrate.
Absolutely.
We're in the middle of
That's
all
exactly
the crises you could ever want.
See, we are all geared towards identifying the problems, solving them, trying to find what next, and that really is because we are in a state of crisis.
So let me open this up because we're having a great time, but you might want to participate. Lucy, did you have a question?
I did. Actually, I wanted to go back to your first question about the threshold and how do we know if we're at a threshold and do we need to be worried about that? And your question really took me back to the beginning of the day, which is when we started talking about measuring sustainability and actually seeing if we're making progress towards goals and seeing if our models, whether they be mental models or mathematical models, are actually holding. And I think about when I first started here at BU, driving around with Nathan Phillips and with a methane sensor in our car. And we saw ridiculously high methane concentrations that didn't make sense. And that didn't conform with the emissions factors and what we really thought that we understood about the system. And those sorts of measurements, some of which are mundane and repetitive, are crucial in both monitoring progress towards sustainability goals and finding out if we're off track on it. So I think that's a key element in defining where thresholds are and assessing where we are in our progress.
Excellent. In the back?
Thank you. Very interesting day. One thing that's been running through my head as I listen to the different points that have been made throughout the day is this whole issue coming back to the human dimension. You've alluded earlier in the day about, we can't forget the distribution of humans around the world today, which is highly unequal, and then the projected growth, which is mostly in the poor population, and the implications that has for future energy use and mitigation and so on, but especially in impacts. And when we've had the discussion about who gets to decide and so on, one of the components that I think those of us who work in technical and scientific backgrounds and modeling, often our tendency is to analyze, gather data, create models, and so on, and make the best picture we can convey. When we're dealing with the human element, oftentimes you see it in reports that at some point as an addendum and by the way, we need to consider the impacts on those who are less, who are more vulnerable and so on. And I would say that with the growing understanding, say on the adaptation side alone, that in fact, most of the most vulnerable are also the most socioeconomically vulnerable, that we need to bring that as sort of at the beginning of the discussion, not as an afterthought about, oh yes, and we have to see how we don't affect them too much. And it is complicated, and for us who are technical, I think it's messy because including them up front means giving them a voice at the table, not afterwards reporting to them. And that's messy because, the very fact that they're socioeconomically disadvantaged means that they're not going to be able to go to meetings all the time, especially during work hours, or they may have competing economic needs. And I don't have the solution to it, but it seems clear to me that those of us who work in the technical fields need to figure out, because it's a problem that doesn't go away, right? And it's going to be bigger in the future, how to include in the agenda up front the people themselves. Because as someone once said, the only factor of production, whatever, that can speak for itself are people. So I think that needs to be something that gets back into the agenda of not just at the level of once research is done and then we go to decision makers and policy makers, but even at the beginning of the research agenda somehow. And it's a messy. I don't have the answer to it, but I increasingly see that that's an important element.
Responses? Viewpoints?
Well, I have inveigled a lot of friends in Africa into coming to my stupid meetings. And they're the people you're talking about, by and large. And one of the problems I've noted is that when someone is in a rough spot, and of course for some of these people that's their whole lives compared to us here, they have to think very short term. And when you have them in the context of a group making a decision, it makes it very difficult. Those people who are like from an indigenous background, they tend to think more long term. They're still human beings, but they have a cultural drive to think about their children and about the long term. Then when they're disenfranchised, often when they're westernized, they lose that until they get an education. And nowadays that means like a university-style education. It may not be the only option. And then they start thinking longer term again. So what I've never understood is how you take a bunch of people who are in totally different headspaces and put them in a room and try to get a meaningful consensus out of that. Maybe the thing you need to do is just be aware of this in the beginning and design the group of people so that they will be capable of reaching a longer-term decision.
Well, I was thinking globally, but also locally. In the U.S., in Massachusetts, in Boston, we all have highly vulnerable communities. So in planning and thinking about these things, for example, there are ways in which one can take a coastal community and make it a lot more resilient, and there are some of those ways can lead to a highly gentrified area because it becomes so much more desirable. Sure. And the people who live there or work there all of a sudden can't do that anymore. So it's a global problem, but it's also very, very much a local problem as well.
Yeah, but one bit of good news. I spent a day with the Gulf Restoration Team in New Orleans a few months ago. They're really doing a good job. They're really getting around some of those problems you're talking about.
But you have a global movement toward populism, which in some historical moments is the ideal thing. You know, the Grange movement across the U.S., a rural movement among farmers. Suddenly that's been co-opted in the U.S. Or you have Venezuela, which was a populist movement, and now transformed into this, whatever's going on in Venezuela now economically, or Bolivia, or places where populism, or even Vietnam, that was a populist movement as much as it was a movement toward world communism. Those have a certain dynamic, and are they short-term or long-term? I think they're a little bit of both. But it makes for disruption. And it means that the policies we're talking about here in general, global systems, would not be applicable. Ho Chi Minh was not going to listen to the World Bank.
Right. Right. Actually, I'm up at night wondering what I'm going to do about the fact that my grad students never get these perspectives. I mean, I talk at them, but they're tired of hearing from me. It's not part and parcel of graduate training in the natural sciences. Similarly, people in humanities and political science often don't understand what the hell the scientists are talking about, and they should at least have a rudimentary ability to parse what they're hearing.
So I'll just, taking up on originally on your question and then this discussion, I'll share one experience that I've had, which actually dates back a number of years to the first of the U.S. National Climate Assessments. And in the context of that assessment, one of the things that a number of us did was do a whole bunch of ecosystem model simulations of the carbon status of forests in the Northeast and what was likely to happen to carbon storage, and were forests going to become may still be a sink, or would they become a source of carbon? We were very proud of these simulations. They were technically proficient. It was really the first time that somebody had coupled some of these ecosystem models with climate models. And so we go around and give talks on them. But when we started giving those talks in New England, one of the things that happened was we would get this feedback from the audience that said, well, this is all very nice, that's cool, but what about the sugar maple? What's going to happen with sugar maple, right? What's going to happen with birch? What's going to happen, and so we were confronted with a different set of questions we had done research on the questions that interested us, as ecosystem ecologists and people interested in the carbon cycle. What we hadn't done was talk to people in these communities who had a different set of questions that would have led, had we followed them, to equally interesting and creative science, but different science than what we were focused on. It would have reordered our priorities had we done that in the opposite direction. Right? And so it really can make a difference sometimes in what, as a technical community, we choose to work on if we decide to listen. Probably not necessarily in the job description for some of us, I suspect. The other just little vignette I'll mention is that sometimes it depends on how you actually perceive your own activities. I did a really interesting project a number of years ago on supply chains, and in particular calculating the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, from every step in the process, from harvesting trees in the forest to turning them into paper to turning them into magazines, for two different kinds of magazines. And this was at the request of Time Publishing, which at the time, maybe still is, was the largest publishing house in the U.S. Created more magazines and books than any other publisher in the U.S. And they were headed by a friend of mine who was absolutely passionate about the environment. And he actually used his position at the end of the supply chain to enforce a whole set of environmental criteria on suppliers. He subsequently got a promotion to be the director of sustainability for Time Inc. He went to his boss, the CEO of Time, this massive multi-billion-dollar public company, and said, you know, we have this enormous environmental footprint. And the response of the CEO was, what in the world are you talking about? We're an entertainment company. And all those books and all that cardboard that was used for packaging for everything from cable boxes to, you know, to CDs and DVDs didn't register. We don't have an environmental footprint. We're an entertainment company. But you do have an environmental footprint. And I think so there is this question of actually understanding the kinds of footprints and consequences that our own activities have can be a major gap. Other questions? Oh, there's one back here, please.
Okay, so my question is, the one question I'll ask will be about conflict. And one of the things that was quite true in the 1990s, when the main issue at that point was not climate change, although it was coming toward climate change, but child survival, that UNICEF found was that they had plans in every country of the world for cutting for advancing child survival and cutting preventable child deaths in half. And the places, obviously, where it didn't work were where there were conflicts. And so I'd like people to talk a little bit more about how the various models or plans for bringing about greater awareness and activity toward climate change operate in context of climate, in context of conflict. And is there a movement toward more local level activity in those contexts where the national government may be in disarray?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, just to say one point to begin would be November 2016, the U.S. election. Already that's in contest. We haven't heard it fully expressed yet, but it will be.
Were the government in disarray?
Could be.
Yeah.
The election process emphasizing, no, don't believe that. I'm not a scientist, but et cetera, we've heard before. Down to the point of the Congolia forest and all the disruption going on there. It's about extraction. It's about mercury being used in mining and the conflict generating possibilities for short-term solutions.
So we actually had a grant for 3 years to figure out the relationship, you're not going to believe this, the relationship between the changing fishery on Lake Victoria, East Africa, and violent insurgency in Central Africa. And that's conflict. And there was a relationship.
Dried fish.
Yeah, dried fish. The fish that went nuts when we completely screwed up Lake Victoria was absolutely the best thing for those guys running around with the guns to stuff into their backpacks so they could make it through the jungle to the next village they were going to desecrate. And the Nile perch itself became the base of an industry that paid for the importation of massive amounts of arms to Central Africa. And what we found is that most of our colleagues in Africa were actually not fully cognizant of those linkages. So just exposing the sort of circulatory system underneath these astounding connections opened their eyes. I don't know if the outcome will be good or bad yet, but it was very important.
Great. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to stop. I'd like us to thank our panelists. And I'm going to give my co-chair, Lucy Hutera, the last word before we break for the reception.
So I think today has been a fantastically interesting day, and now I'm between all of us and cocktails, I believe. So I'll be very brief, but I wanted to kind of remind us for a moment what our goals were and why Tony and I co-opted all of these wonderful speakers today. And that's that sustainability is clearly hard. In the words of Michael Gavelber, it's a hard problem that we have before us. It's a critical problem that we have before us. And there are a tremendous number of us working on different facets of it. And I think that what we've had today is a great demonstration of the breadth of different research that's happening on different facets of sustainability. And the opportunity that we have before us is to bring this together. Bring this together at a time when it's critical for our environment, but it's also critical for this university. Bob Brown, I've borrowed the pledge. He signed the White House he signed the White House Act on the Climate Pledge to support academic research to better understand the factors that influence climate change and the strategies to mitigate climate change. That's at the core of what we've been talking about today. And I think we have a huge opportunity before us and a receptive university to enhance the collaborations between all that we've heard today, as well as fundamentally advance the scientific and societal challenges that we have before us. So Tony and I will be pulling together a report that follows on today's conference. And so I will invite all of you to flood our inboxes with...
We'll be sorry.
Okay, flood Tony's... No. Flood our inboxes and offer us your thoughts, vision, and ideas. You know, Ann Short spoke very eloquently about how critical it is to have a shared vision. And we don't necessarily need to have one shared vision for what we can and should be doing on this front, but I think it would be incredibly valuable to offer perhaps a suite of visions and opportunities where we can leverage the huge amount of activity that we have going on in this area. So I am very excited and very optimistic, and I'm proud to see these sustainability efforts moving forward. So let's thank CAS, the Pardee Center, the Pardee School, the Energy Initiative. Is that everybody?
No, you and Tony.
Oh yeah, okay. Tony, and of course all of our panelists who I think have made today a wonderful day. So thank you all.